Plymouth Harbor, January 1944. Admiral Sir Charles Little, a veteran of 3 decades in the Royal Navy, stood at his window watching the gray water churn. He had seen the Grand Fleet at Scapa Flow and orchestrated the miracle at Dunkirk. But what he saw now defied his understanding of naval limits. 18 American Liberty ships were cutting through the mist, riding so low their plimsoll lines were buried beneath the waterline. Their decks were stacked 10 feet high with crates and tarp-covered machinery. When Little asked his logistics officer for the total count of American vessels in the port, the answer was staggering: 217, with 84 more expected in days. 5 months before the invasion, the Americans weren't just contributing, they were dismantling the concept of scarcity.
Write in the comments where you are watching us from. I'm very curious. Subscribe for many more interesting stories.
By early March, the physics of the invasion collided with British geography. The southern coast had a finite amount of shoreline, yet the American influx was relentless. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay received reports from Falmouth that sounded absurd. The density of ships was so high, their swing radii overlapped. When Ramsay traveled to the coast, he didn't see a log jam. He saw a new geography. Lines of LSTs, landing ship tanks, anchored in columns extended 3 miles into the open sound. The vessels were packed so tightly, bow to stern, that a man could physically walk from the shore to the harbor mouth without touching salt water. The Americans had solved the shortage of docking space by simply turning the English Channel into a floating parking lot of steel. British Admiralty logistics officers reviewed American production figures with disbelief. In 1941, it took 244 days to build a Liberty ship. By 1944, the Americans were launching 3 Liberty ships every single day. Some yards completed an ocean-going vessel every 4 days from a single slipway. A note circulated through the Admiralty: "They are not building ships, they are manufacturing them." While the British built ships like cathedrals, with craftsmanship and tradition, the Americans applied the violence of the assembly line to naval architecture. The result was a fleet growing faster than the enemy could sink it, and faster than the ocean could hold it. Tonnage alone wouldn't win the war. The Allies needed specialized tools. The LST was an ugly, slow, flat-bottomed ship, but it was a mechanized army's lifeline. By May 1944, Ramsay counted over 200 American LSTs in one anchorage, each carrying 20 Sherman tanks or 33 heavy trucks. Simultaneously, at the American depot near Weymouth, Admiral Sir Philip Vian examined the Higgins boats, LCVPs, boxy plywood boxes that looked like floating coffins. When Vian worried that German machine guns would shred them, the American response revealed a terrifying industrial doctrine. "We didn't build them to last, we built them to be replaced." They treated naval vessels like bullets, disposable mass meant to be fired and forgotten. As the focus shifted to firepower, Admiral Vian inspected the fire support group. He expected light support, but instead found a ghost: the USS Nevada. The ship that had been a burning wreck on the bottom of Pearl Harbor had been raised, patched, modernized, and sailed across the Atlantic. She was joined by the Texas and the Arkansas. The Americans had stripped heavy capital ships from the global board, providing more heavy gun barrels for their 2 beaches than the Royal Navy had for their 3. The corpse of Pearl Harbor had come to Europe to exact its revenge. June 4th brought a gale and a 24-hour postponement, a logistical nightmare for a fleet with 156,000 men sealed inside steel ships. While British port commanders panicked about rationing bread and meat for the delay, the American logistics officers remained calm. They hadn't just packed for the invasion, they had packed for the catastrophe. "We brought double," an American officer noted. They had millions of extra rations and tankers full of fuel waiting in the rear echelon. A British officer recorded in his diary the fundamental difference. "They think in terms of abundance. We think in terms of scarcity." Dawn, June 6th, 0550 hours. The bombardment was not a softening up. It was the physical erasure of the coastline. The Nevada, Texas, and Arkansas opened fire with 1,400-pound shells the size of small cars. The sound was a continuous, rolling tear in the atmosphere, felt 40 miles away in England. Targets were hit with sniper-like precision as entire hillsides simply ceased to exist. This was the American way of war, the application of overwhelming catastrophic energy to a single point until the enemy was pulverized by the industrial output of Pittsburgh and Bethlehem steel. At Omaha Beach, the slaughter was real, and General Bradley considered evacuation. But a German officer looking out from his bunker saw terrifying truth. No matter how many Americans he killed, the horizon was full of fresh waves. Behind the dying men were hundreds of Higgins boats, and behind them, hundreds of LSTs. Unlike the British at Dieppe, the Americans simply kept feeding the grinder until the grinder broke. They won not with superior tactics, but with a relentless, inexhaustible conveyor belt of men and materiel. By the end of June, they had landed 850,000 men and 570,000 tons of supplies. The invasion wasn't an event. It was a continuous, unbroken flow of American will.